On January 7, 1942, Adolf Hitler sat at his headquarters in East Prussia and rendered a judgment that would shape the remainder of the war. Germany was already fighting Britain across the Channel and the Soviet Union across the plains of Eastern Europe. 4 days earlier, Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States had entered the war. Hitler now turned his attention westward and asked a question that would soon be answered with catastrophic clarity. He did not fear America. Speaking to his inner circle, Hitler dismissed the United States as a decaying society. He described it as fractured by race, divided by class, corrupted by what he believed were Jewish influences, and fundamentally incapable of cohesion. A nation so internally conflicted, he argued, could not endure the pressures of total war. Distance, diversity, and democracy would tear it apart long before it could threaten Germany. For Hitler, this was not speculation. It was ideology. National strength, in his worldview, flowed from racial homogeneity and authoritarian unity. Germany possessed both. America, a nation of immigrants, African Americans, labor unions, and political dissent, possessed neither. Hitler concluded that whatever material resources the United States claimed to have were irrelevant. Without racial purity and ideological discipline, those resources could not be harnessed effectively. The verdict was final. 7,000 miles away, on the opposite edge of the continent Hitler had just dismissed, a very different calculation was taking shape. In a modest office near the shipyards of Richmond, California, Henry Kaiser, a 57-year-old industrialist, was sketching ideas on a scrap of hotel stationery. Kaiser had never built a ship. His experience lay in dams, highways, and bridges. He had overseen massive civil engineering projects during the New Deal and learned how to organize labor, materials, and time on a scale few Americans could match. Shipbuilding, according to established experts, was a craft. It required years of apprenticeship, skilled riveters, and slow, methodical construction. A standard cargo ship, they said, took 8 months to build under optimal conditions. Kaiser looked at the numbers and reached a different conclusion. He told his team they would build one in 4 days. To the men who had spent decades in shipyards, this was absurd. To Kaiser, it was simply a manufacturing problem. The product happened to float. The misjudgment that doomed Nazi Germany did not begin with Pearl Harbor or Hitler's declaration of war on the United States 4 days later. It began years earlier, with a systematic misunderstanding of what American power actually was. German military intelligence in the late 1930s devoted considerable effort to studying the United States. Reports assessed American industrial capacity, military readiness, and national character. The conclusions were strikingly uniform. America was wealthy but soft. Its people were consumers, not soldiers. Its factories produced automobiles and refrigerators, not tanks and aircraft. Its army, in 1939, ranked among the smallest in the world, smaller even than Portugal's. The data seemed to support the judgment. In 1939, American military aircraft production totaled fewer than 3,000 planes. The United States Army was poorly equipped and lightly trained. The nation had endured a decade of economic depression and shown little appetite for foreign war. Isolationist sentiment dominated politics. Congress debated neutrality acts, while Europe burned. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that the United States would produce 50,000 aircraft per year, the German High Command dismissed the claim as propaganda. To increase production by nearly 20 times in such a short period appeared impossible. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, laughed openly at the idea. Goering believed he understood aircraft production. He had overseen the creation of the Luftwaffe from nothing into Europe's most feared air force. He knew the demands of precision engineering, the difficulty of producing specialized alloys, the years required to train skilled workers and refine production methods. America, in his view, possessed none of these advantages. The notion that automobile factories could be transformed into aircraft plants struck him as fantasy. German generals also relied on historical memory. During the First World War, American troops had arrived in France late. They had fought competently, but not decisively. Their casualties were light compared to those of Britain, France, and Germany. They had not shaped strategy. To many German officers, the American contribution in 1918 reinforced the belief that the United States lacked the hardness required for sustained, high-intensity combat. Albert Speer, who would later become Minister of Armaments, recalled Hitler's dinner-table discussions about America. Hitler argued that Americans had not made serious sacrifices in the Great War and would not withstand the demands of another. In his telling, there was no such thing as an American people, only a collection of immigrants divided by origin and interest. This racial analysis was not peripheral. It was central. Nazi ideology taught that racial purity produced national strength. America's diversity appeared, through this lens, as proof of weakness. If the ideology was correct, America had to be incapable of mobilizing effectively. Any evidence to the contrary was dismissed as deception or exaggeration. This logic contained a fatal flaw. German planners assessed America based on its performance in peacetime and assumed that performance defined its limits. They saw factories producing consumer goods and concluded they could not produce weapons. They saw political debate and concluded unity was impossible. They mistook unpreparedness for incapacity. They never asked what would happen if American industry was reorganized for war. That transformation began before the United States formally entered the conflict. In the summer of 1940, with France defeated and Britain under sustained aerial assault, Roosevelt challenged American industry to what he called a miracle of production. Automobile factories would cease civilian output. Appliance plants would halt refrigerator production. Assembly lines designed for comfort and convenience would be redirected toward war. The shift was not symbolic, it was structural. In 1941, American factories produced more than 3 million automobiles. Over the next 4 years, only 139 additional cars would be built. The automotive industry was effectively shut down as a consumer enterprise and reborn as an arsenal. Chrysler produced fuselages. General Motors manufactured aircraft engines, tanks, trucks, and machine guns. Packard built Rolls-Royce Merlin engines for British fighters. Companies that had never handled explosives learned to produce ammunition. The speed of the conversion shocked even American officials. What German planners failed to understand was that American industry possessed capabilities that were invisible in peacetime statistics. The most important was standardization. For decades, American manufacturers had perfected the use of interchangeable parts. Components produced in different factories by different workers in different states fit together precisely. A carburetor built in Ohio could be installed in an engine assembled in Michigan and mounted in a vehicle completed in California. This system had been developed to serve consumer markets, not military ones. But once applied to weapons production, its implications were profound. Skeptics argued that aircraft were not automobiles. A heavy bomber contained over 1 million parts, compared to roughly 15,000 in a car. Tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. systems had to function at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Precision was non-negotiable. Henry Kaiser ignored the skeptics. In December 1940, he received a contract to build 30 cargo ships for Britain. He had no shipyard, no trained workforce, and no background in maritime construction. What he had was an organizational philosophy. Every production process, Kaiser believed, could be analyzed, broken into components, optimized, and accelerated. Traditional shipbuilders relied on apprenticeship. Kaiser substituted machinery for skill wherever possible. Tasks that once required years of experience were redesigned so they could be learned in days. Welding replaced riveting. Entire sections of ships were prefabricated and assembled like modules. The experts said such ships would be unsafe. The ocean would expose every flaw. Vessels built by amateurs would fail. They did not. Kaiser's ships were not only faster to build, they were more reliable. Defect rates at his yards were less than half those of conventional shipyards. The same processes that increased speed also improved quality. Workers arrived from across the country. Farmers displaced by drought, factory workers idled by the Depression, women who had never worked outside the home, African Americans seeking opportunities denied to them in segregated industries elsewhere. Training programs reduced learning curves from years to weeks. A new welder could be productive in 10 days. By 1941, the average Liberty ship required 230 days to build. By 1942, Kaiser's yards reduced that to 45 days, then 30, then 20. In November 1942, the Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days and 15 hours. At the moment Hitler declared America irrelevant, Germany's enemies were learning to compress time itself. This was the America Hitler never saw. Not the America of peace, consumption, and political debate, but the America of systems, scale, and relentless iteration. A society capable of discarding old methods, training millions from scratch, and turning civilian abundance into military power with frightening speed. The verdict delivered in East Prussia rested on ideology. The reality forming in California rested on arithmetic. And arithmetic would not be negotiated. What German planners failed to grasp was not the scale of American industry, but its structure. Their intelligence reports measured output, counted factories, and compared peacetime statistics. They assessed how many tanks, ships, and aircraft the United States produced in 1938 and 1939, and concluded that America could not possibly compete with a continent already mobilized for war. The error was not mathematical. It was conceptual. German industry was optimized for excellence within limits. American industry was optimized for expansion. In Germany, industrial power was concentrated in specialized firms that relied on highly trained craftsmen, long production cycles, and rigid hierarchies. Precision was achieved through experience. Efficiency came from discipline. Scaling production meant building new factories, training new specialists, and accepting long delays before output increased. This system produced superb weapons, but it was brittle. When skilled workers were lost, when raw materials ran short, when factories were bombed, production faltered. American industry functioned differently. For decades, it had been designed not to perfect individual products, but to replicate them endlessly. The goal was not mastery of craft, but mastery of process. Assembly lines, interchangeable parts, standardized tooling, and decentralized supply chains allowed production to be expanded rapidly without waiting for artisanal skill to develop. German planners saw American factories making refrigerators and automobiles and concluded those factories were irrelevant to war. They failed to recognize that the underlying systems, the presses, lathes, conveyor belts, logistics networks, and managerial practices were the real weapons. The automobile industry was the clearest example. By 1940, the United States produced more cars than the rest of the world combined. This was not because American engineers were more talented, but because American factories were organized to produce at scale. A single design could be replicated thousands of times with minimal variation. When Roosevelt ordered civilian automobile production halted in early 1942, the physical infrastructure did not disappear. It was repurposed. The Germans assumed this conversion would take years. In practice, it took months. General Motors alone operated dozens of plants across the country, each already accustomed to producing components to exact specifications. When tasked with military production, these plants did not need to reinvent themselves. They redirected existing capabilities. One facility produced machine guns. Another produced aircraft engines. A third assembled tanks. The same systems that once coordinated consumer supply chains now coordinated war materiel. German analysts underestimated the importance of standardization. In Germany, weapons programs frequently relied on unique designs and constant modification. Tanks and aircraft were improved continuously, but this created production bottlenecks. Each change required retooling. Each variation complicated logistics. Spare parts became scarce. Field repairs grew difficult. American designers accepted imperfection in exchange for consistency. A Sherman tank was not the best tank on the battlefield, but it could be built quickly, repaired easily, and supplied reliably. The same philosophy applied to aircraft, trucks, artillery, and ships. The objective was not superiority in any single engagement, but dominance over time. This distinction mattered enormously in a war of attrition. German planners believed that quality would compensate for quantity. American planners believed quantity, if sustained, would eventually overwhelm quality. The second assumption proved correct. The shipbuilding program revealed the difference most starkly. Traditional European shipyards treated ship construction as a sequential process. A vessel was built from the keel up on a single slipway. Skilled trades worked in sequence. Progress depended on the availability of experienced craftsmen. This method produced durable ships, but imposed natural limits on speed. Henry Kaiser rejected this logic entirely. To him, a ship was not a vessel. It was a collection of sub-assemblies. Hull sections, deckhouses, engine compartments, and superstructures could be built simultaneously in different locations. Welding replaced riveting not only because it was faster, but because it could be learned quickly. A riveter required years of training. A welder could be trained in days. German engineers dismissed welded ships as unsafe. They assumed quality must decline as speed increased. They did not understand that Kaiser was substituting capital investment and process control for individual craftsmanship. Kaiser's yards used jigs, fixtures, and standardized procedures to ensure consistency. Errors were identified and corrected systematically. The result was not chaos, but repetition. Each ship was more similar to the last than any vessel built under traditional methods. The labor force itself was a weapon the Germans never calculated properly. Germany's workforce was constrained by ideology and policy. Women were discouraged from industrial labor. Forced labor from occupied territories was exploited, but poorly trained and often sabotaged. Skilled workers were drafted into the military, hollowing out factories. Production increasingly relied on coercion rather than motivation. American industry expanded its labor pool instead of narrowing it. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers. African Americans migrated north and west to take jobs previously closed to them. Teenagers, retirees, and displaced farmers filled gaps. Training programs assumed no prior experience and were designed accordingly. The objective was not to create craftsmen, but to create throughput. German intelligence noticed the demographic shifts, but misinterpreted them. Diversity, they believed, would undermine discipline and productivity. In reality, it expanded capacity. American managers built housing near factories, established childcare centers, and created healthcare systems to reduce absenteeism. These measures were not humanitarian gestures. They were efficiency decisions. Healthy workers missed fewer shifts. Workers with childcare showed up on time. Stability increased output. The Germans saw only disorder. They did not see the feedback loops that allowed American industry to learn and adjust rapidly. When defects appeared, processes were modified. When bottlenecks emerged, resources were shifted. Authority was decentralized. Decisions were made close to the problem, not filtered upward through rigid hierarchies. This adaptability extended beyond factories to the military itself. American production was tightly linked to operational feedback. Equipment was modified based on reports from the field. Designs were simplified to ease manufacturing and maintenance. German systems, by contrast, often pursued technical perfection even when it complicated production and logistics. The result was asymmetry. Germany produced weapons that were individually superior but increasingly rare. America produced weapons that were individually adequate but ubiquitous. Over time, ubiquity mattered more. By the time German planners began to realize the implications, the system was already in motion. Factories were running around the clock. Supply chains spanned continents. Training pipelines fed both industry and the armed forces simultaneously. What Germany had dismissed as civilian abundance was being converted into military inevitability. The system they misunderstood was not American patriotism, or American courage, or even American leadership. It was American organization. The ability to take chaos, break it into manageable components, and scale solutions faster than any opponent could. Adapt. Hitler believed America lacked cohesion. He mistook decentralization for weakness. In reality, it was the source of American strength. By early 1942, German naval planners believed they were finally fighting the war they had prepared for. France had fallen. Britain stood isolated. The Soviet Union was locked in a brutal struggle in the East. Now the United States had entered the conflict seemingly unprepared, its coastlines exposed, its shipping undefended. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat arm, was confident. His strategy rested on arithmetic. Submarines would sink Allied merchant shipping faster than the Allies could replace it. Britain, dependent on imported food, fuel, and raw materials, would starve. American industry, still converting to war production, would collapse under the strain. The Atlantic would decide the war. For several months, the numbers appeared to confirm him. In early 1942, German submarines surged into American coastal waters during what U-boat crews called the Second Happy Time. American cities remained brightly lit at night. Ships sailed independently, silhouetted against shorelights. Convoys were disorganized or non-existent. Anti-submarine patrols were sparse. U-boat commanders scarcely believed their luck. Reinhard Hardigan of U-123 torpedoed merchant ships so close to shore that he could see the glow of American cities reflected in the smoke. Tankers burned within sight of Florida beaches. Cargo vessels sank off New Jersey while crowds gathered on shore to watch. Hardigan alone sank 8 ships on his first patrol and returned to Germany a celebrated ace. By the summer of 1942, nearly 400 ships had been sunk in American coastal waters. Oil intended for Allied armies burned at sea. Food destined for Britain lay on the ocean floor. Strategic materials vanished in explosions that lit the night sky. Dönitz believed he was winning. What he did not yet understand was that the battlefield he was fighting on, the Atlantic, had become secondary. The decisive struggle was unfolding inland, far from torpedoes and periscopes, in places German intelligence never considered decisive. In Richmond, California, Henry Kaiser's shipyards were beginning to operate at a tempo that defied every assumption German planners had made about industrial limits. Traditional shipbuilders measured progress in months. Kaiser measured it in days. The Liberty ship program had been conceived as an emergency solution. A standardized cargo vessel, simple, ugly, slow, but cheap and fast to build. German analysts assumed such ships would be rare, poorly constructed, and easily replaced only after long delays. They were wrong. Kaiser's approach treated ships not as handcrafted vessels, but as manufactured objects. Hull sections were prefabricated in multiple locations. Welding replaced riveting almost entirely. Jigs and templates ensured uniformity. Entire sections were assembled simultaneously, then joined in. Sequence. The workforce was assembled just as ruthlessly. Men and women arrived from across the country. Many had never seen the ocean. Few had industrial experience. Training programs assumed ignorance and designed around it. Workers learned specific tasks, not entire trades. 10 days to learn welding, 30 days to be productive. Skill was no longer the bottleneck. By mid-1941, the average Liberty ship required 230 days to build. By early 1942, Kaiser's yards reduced that figure to 45 days, then to 30, then to 20. In November 1942, Kaiser's Richmond yard completed the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in 4 days and 15 hours, from keel laying to launch. The time required to build a ship had become shorter than the time required for a German submarine to cross the Atlantic. This was the moment the arithmetic turned against Germany. U-boats could still sink ships, but they could not sink them fast enough. Every merchant vessel destroyed was replaced by 2 more sliding down American slipways. Losses that would have been catastrophic in the First World War became tolerable in the Second. By 1942, American shipyards launched approximately 8 million tons of new shipping. In 1943, they launched 19 million tons. By the autumn of 1943, new construction exceeded losses for the first time. Dönitz watched the numbers with growing alarm. His submarines were achieving kill rates that would have strangled Britain 25 years earlier. But the target was moving, always receding, always just beyond reach. He calculated that 700,000 tons of Allied shipping had to be sunk each month to force Britain out of the war. By 1943, American yards alone were launching more than 1 million tons per month. The equation was hopeless. Even worse for Germany, the Americans were learning. The disasters of early 1942 exposed glaring weaknesses in American anti-submarine warfare. Convoys were introduced. Coastal blackouts were enforced. Long-range patrol aircraft extended coverage into previously unprotected waters. Radar and improved sonar narrowed the submarine's advantage. By May 1943, the U-boat arm reached its breaking point. In a single month, 43 submarines were destroyed. Crews died faster than replacements could be trained. Dönitz ordered a withdrawal from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, the campaign Germany had to win, was lost. What happened at sea was mirrored in the air. Outside Detroit, at Willow Run, another industrial experiment was unfolding, one far larger and more complex than Liberty ships. The Ford Motor Company had been tasked with producing the B-24 Liberator, a four-engine heavy bomber more complicated than anything the automobile industry had ever attempted. The factory itself was unprecedented. Designed by Albert Kahn, Willow Run covered more than 3.5 million square feet, making it the largest industrial facility under one roof anywhere in the world. Its purpose was not to build aircraft efficiently by existing standards, but to redefine those standards entirely. The B-24 contained over 1 million parts and more than 300,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. Aircraft manufacturing traditionally relied on skilled craftsmen assembling planes largely by hand. Ford rejected this approach. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, examined Consolidated Aircraft's methods and deemed them archaic. Bombers were assembled outdoors. Processes were inconsistent. Tolerances varied. Sorensen proposed building aircraft on a moving assembly line, just like cars. The industry recoiled. Aircraft manufacturers insisted it could not be done. Automotive tolerances were too loose. Aircraft tolerances were unforgiving. A car with minor flaws could still run. An aircraft with minor flaws could crash. Early results seemed to vindicate the skeptics. Design changes from Consolidated disrupted the assembly line. Workers struggled to adapt. The press mocked the project, calling it "Will It Run?" instead of Willow Run. Senator Harry Truman investigated delays and publicly questioned Ford's competence. Ford did not abandon the concept. Instead, it applied brute organizational force. 200 engineers worked around the clock, converting hand-drawn aircraft sketches into precise manufacturing specifications, producing miles of drawings every day. When design changes rendered drawings obsolete, they started again without complaint. Production was decentralized. Components were manufactured by a vast network of subcontractors. Engines came from Buick in Flint, propellers from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut, landing gear from Goodyear in Ohio. The logistics were staggering, but Ford's supply chain experience made them manageable. By 1944, the problems were solved. Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes. In April 1944 alone, 453 bombers rolled off the line. Between April 24th and April 26th, 100 completed bombers flew away in just 72 hours. At peak efficiency, the workforce shrank even as output rose. Fewer workers produced more aircraft. The Army Air Forces eventually asked Ford to slow production because airfields had no space left to park completed bombers. German intelligence had dismissed American production targets as fantasy. They were not fantasy. They were conservative. By 1944, the United States produced over 96,000 military aircraft in a single year, more than Japan built during the entire war. Nearly 300,000 aircraft were produced between 1940 and 1945, accounting for roughly two-thirds of all Allied output. The factories ran continuously. Shifts changed at noon and midnight. The machines never stopped. The shock was not merely quantitative. It was psychological. German planners had assumed that industrial miracles were impossible without centralized control and ideological discipline. They now faced an enemy whose decentralized chaos produced results no command economy could match. The war had become a contest of systems, and Germany was losing it. By mid-1943, German commanders were confronting a reality they had never planned for. The war they were fighting no longer resembled the conflict they had prepared to win. The assumptions that had guided German strategy since 1939 were collapsing under the weight of evidence. At sea, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its turning point. Admiral Karl Dönitz understood the implications before most of his peers. Submarine warfare had been Germany's best hope of neutralizing Britain and delaying American mobilization. It had failed. The early months of 1942 had offered a glimpse of victory. Nearly 400 Allied ships had been sunk along the American coast in 6 months. Tankers burned within sight of shore. Merchant crews died without ever seeing an escort. For a brief period, German submarines enjoyed freedom of movement unmatched at any other point in the war. But freedom without sustainability was meaningless. By late 1942, the Americans had corrected their early mistakes. Convoys became mandatory. Coastal blackouts removed the visual advantage U-boat commanders had exploited. Long-range patrol aircraft closed the air gap that had once protected submarines. Radar and improved sonar narrowed the margins further. Losses mounted. In May 1943 alone, 43 German submarines were destroyed. Entire crews vanished. Veteran commanders were killed faster than replacements could be trained. Dönitz, who had built his strategy on patience and attrition, now faced attrition himself. He ordered the withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging privately what could not yet be admitted publicly. The Atlantic campaign was over. German submariners returned to bases in occupied France, shaken. They had gone to sea believing they were winning. They returned knowing that every patrol now carried diminishing returns. The convoys they once stalked with impunity now bristled with escorts. Aircraft seemed omnipresent. The balance of initiative had shifted irreversibly. The same pattern appeared in the air. The Luftwaffe entered the war with advantages that few air forces could match. German pilots were superbly trained. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190 were among the finest fighters in the world. In individual engagements, German pilots often outperformed their opponents. But wars were not decided by individual engagements. American bomber crews in 1942 and early 1943 were inexperienced. Many pilots had fewer than 300 hours of flight time when they entered combat. Navigation errors were common. Bombing accuracy was poor. Coordination with escorts was imperfect. German pilots exploited these weaknesses mercilessly. Losses were severe. In daylight raids over Germany, entire bomber formations were shredded by flak and fighters. Head-on attacks at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour gave gunners only seconds to react. Rockets fired from beyond defensive gun range tore aircraft apart. For German airmen, it seemed that skill and courage could still prevail. But attrition told a different story. Every American aircraft shot down was replaced within weeks. Every German aircraft lost represented months of production and a pilot who could not be easily replaced. German training programs could not keep pace with losses. Fuel shortages reduced flight hours. Experience levels declined steadily. The American response to loss was not caution. It was scale. American flight schools processed thousands of cadets simultaneously. Trainers were available in abundance because the same factories producing combat aircraft also produced trainers. Instructors flew multiple sorties per day. Training was standardized, streamlined, and relentless. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing approximately 25% of its aircrews and 40% of its aircraft every month. No air force could survive such losses indefinitely. Veteran pilots who had begun the war with years of experience were replaced by young men with weeks of training and fewer than 100 hours in the cockpit. The Americans, by contrast, improved. The survivors of the disastrous 1943 raids became instructors for the crews of 1944. Tactics evolved. Equipment improved. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with its long range and exceptional performance, transformed the air war. For the first time, bombers could be escorted all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe now faced an impossible equation. Quality no longer compensated for quantity. Skill could not offset arithmetic. German ground forces encountered the same dynamic in North Africa. In February 1943, American troops met the German army in combat for the first time at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. The result seemed to confirm every German prejudice. Units broke. Command collapsed. Equipment was abandoned. American casualties exceeded 6,000. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces tore through inexperienced American positions with professional precision. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, General George Patton's son-in-law, was wounded and captured during a failed counterattack. Reports filtering back to Berlin reinforced the belief that Americans lacked fighting quality. But Rommel noticed something others did not. The American recovery was immediate. Within weeks, incompetent commanders were relieved. Units were reorganized. Lessons were analyzed and disseminated. General George S. Patton took command of 2nd Corps and imposed discipline with ruthless intensity. Training intensified. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery improved rapidly. This was not improvisation. It was institutional learning. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair ordered a comprehensive review of the failure. Findings were transmitted back to training centers in the United States, shaping the preparation of divisions that had not yet deployed. Mistakes made in February became doctrine by March. Rommel later recorded his observations. American defensive conduct, he wrote, improved rapidly. The enemy learned quickly, adjusted tactics, and halted German advances sooner than expected. By May 1943, the North African campaign was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, more than at Stalingrad. The Americans who had fled at Kasserine now stood among the victors. The speed of recovery shocked German commanders. In their experience, routed units required months to regain effectiveness. The Americans rebuilt in weeks. This resilience was more troubling than their material abundance. German prisoners reported astonishment at American logistics. Ammunition seemed limitless. Fuel shortages were unknown. When supplies ran low, replacements arrived almost immediately. Material superiority compensated for inexperience. The conclusion was unavoidable, though few in Berlin were willing to state it openly. As long as American factories continued to run, American armies would continue to fight and improve. Germany could not win quickly enough to make that irrelevant. The war of attrition Germany had expected to dominate was now consuming it instead. For the German High Command, the battles of early 1943 appeared to confirm long-held beliefs. At Kasserine Pass, inexperienced American troops had broken under pressure. Command structures collapsed. Tanks were lost, artillery abandoned, positions overrun. To many German officers, this was proof that American material abundance could not compensate for inferior fighting quality. The conclusion was premature. What followed Kasserine was something German doctrine did not account for: rapid institutional learning on a massive scale. The American Army did not treat Kasserine as an embarrassment to be concealed. It treated it as data. Within days, reports flowed upward. Tactical failures were documented in detail. Communications breakdowns, poor reconnaissance, misused armor, improperly sighted artillery, and weak command relationships were identified with brutal honesty. Responsibility was assigned without ritual humiliation. Major General Lloyd Friedendahl, commander of 2nd Corps, was relieved. He was not executed, imprisoned, or publicly disgraced. He was reassigned to a training role in the United States, where his experience, even his failure, was considered useful. The American system did not destroy failed leaders. It recycled them. General George S. Patton was sent to Tunisia. Patton's arrival marked a sharp shift in tone. Discipline tightened immediately. Uniform standards were enforced. Units drilled relentlessly. Commanders were expected to lead from the front and make decisions under pressure. Sloppiness was punished. Initiative was demanded. But Patton did more than impose discipline. He studied the German methods that had shattered American lines and adapted to them. Tank units were retrained to avoid unsupported advances. Artillery observers were repositioned forward, ensuring rapid fire support. Infantry armor coordination was emphasized relentlessly. Air support procedures were refined, so strikes could be called in faster and with greater precision. These changes were not local improvisations. They were formalized. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, ordered a comprehensive review of the North African fighting. Lessons learned in Tunisia were transmitted back to training centers across the United States within weeks. Manuals were updated. Training curricula were revised. Units that had not yet seen combat were trained on the mistakes made by those who had. Failure became instruction. This feedback loop was foreign to German military culture. The Wehrmacht prized doctrine, hierarchy, and obedience. Initiative existed, but only within defined bounds. When operations failed, responsibility often flowed downward. Careers ended. Sometimes lives did. Officers learned quickly that honesty carried risk. Adaptation slowed. American institutions rewarded adaptation. Within 3 months of Kasserine, the transformation was visible. In March and April 1943, American units fought German forces on equal terms across Tunisia. By May, the campaign was over. 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered. It was the largest mass capitulation of Axis forces in the war, exceeding even Stalingrad. German commanders were unsettled. They had expected American forces to require long periods of recovery after defeat. That expectation came from their own experience. Units that broke often needed months to regain cohesion. The Americans recovered in weeks. Erwin Rommel noticed. Though he had initially dismissed American troops as undisciplined, Rommel observed their rapid improvement. He recorded that American defensive conduct became increasingly effective, that coordination improved, and that German advances slowed sooner than anticipated. Rommel understood something many of his peers did not. He was facing an enemy that learned faster than he could adapt. This pattern repeated itself in the air. American bomber losses in 1943 were severe. Raids on targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of aircrew in single days. German fighters exploited predictable formations and limited escort ranges. Flak defenses extracted a steady toll. The American response was not to retreat from daylight bombing permanently. Instead, tactics evolved. Formations were adjusted. Bombing altitudes changed. Electronic countermeasures were introduced. Most importantly, escort fighters with extended range were prioritized. The P-51 Mustang was the result. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and long-range fuel tanks, the P-51 could accompany bombers deep into Germany and remain with them throughout the mission. By early 1944, American bombers no longer flew unprotected beyond the Rhine. The Luftwaffe began to bleed. Experienced German pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. Training hours were cut due to fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at the front with a fraction of the experience their predecessors had possessed. By contrast, American training pipelines expanded. Losses were absorbed. Survivors became instructors. Knowledge accumulated. Again, learning compounded. The Germans mistook American improvement for brute force alone. They attributed success to numbers, not to adaptation. This misinterpretation allowed them to preserve a comforting illusion that German martial superiority still existed in principle, even if it was being overwhelmed by material excess. In reality, the gap was closing on every level. American combined arms doctrine matured rapidly. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air power were increasingly integrated. When American units encountered resistance, they did not rely solely on courage or maneuver. They applied firepower. Artillery concentrations were massive. Ammunition expenditure was deliberate and overwhelming. German soldiers noticed the difference. Prisoners captured in Tunisia and later in Italy and France reported astonishment at American logistics. Ammunition shortages were unknown. Fuel arrived on schedule. Hot meals were routine. Wounded soldiers were evacuated quickly. Replacement equipment appeared without delay. German units, by contrast, increasingly fought with rationed supplies, improvised repairs, and dwindling reserves. The lesson was becoming impossible to ignore. Material abundance mattered, but only because American institutions could convert that abundance into effective combat power, faster than Germany could adapt to counter it. Germany had built an army optimized for early victory. America was building one optimized for continuous improvement. The war was no longer about who fought best on a given day. It was about who learned fastest over time. And on that battlefield, Germany was falling behind. By 1944, the consequences of Germany's misjudgment of the United States were no longer theoretical. They were visible on every front, measurable in every ledger, and unavoidable in every strategic calculation. The war Germany had planned to win through speed, shock, and superior fighting quality had become a contest of endurance. Exactly the kind of war Germany could not afford to fight. Nowhere was this clearer than in Western Europe. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. More than 156,000 troops came ashore on the first day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and over 11,000 aircraft. The scale of the operation stunned German commanders in France. They had expected an invasion, but not one of such magnitude. nor one so thoroughly supported by air, sea, and logistics. The equipment that made the invasion possible told its own story. Landing craft were built in American shipyards. Transport aircraft came from American factories. Tanks, trucks, artillery, radios, fuel, ammunition, and rations flowed across the English Channel in volumes German planners had considered impossible. The logistical achievement required to sustain this force on hostile shores exceeded anything attempted in military history. German defenders fought with characteristic determination. In some sectors, they inflicted heavy casualties. But resistance could not compensate for disparity. When American infantry encountered fortified positions, they called for artillery. What followed was not a handful of shells, but hundreds, sometimes thousands, delivered with precision and speed. When artillery proved insufficient, air power was summoned. When resistance persisted, armor followed. American doctrine prioritized firepower over manpower. Why risk soldiers when ammunition was cheaper? German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front recognized the difference immediately. Soviet forces overwhelmed positions with men. American forces overwhelmed them with machines. The outcome was similar. The cost in American lives was lower. This approach was not accidental. It was the logical extension of an industrial system designed to substitute production for blood. As Allied armies broke out of Normandy and advanced across France, the logistical apparatus expanded with them. The Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, moved approximately 400,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months. Many of the drivers were African American soldiers serving in segregated transportation units. They drove day and night to keep fuel, ammunition, and food flowing forward. The convoys consumed more fuel than some combat formations. America had fuel to spare. Germany did not. By late 1944, the contrast was absolute. American units received hot meals, replacement equipment, and prompt medical evacuation. German units scavenged, rationed ammunition, and abandoned vehicles for lack of fuel. Repairs were improvised. Replacement weapons rarely arrived. The Wehrmacht that had once conquered Europe now struggled to sustain itself. The same imbalance defined the air war. The 8th Air Force, operating primarily from bases in England, conducted sustained daylight bombing campaigns over Germany that would have been inconceivable without American industrial capacity. Early raids suffered severe losses. In October 1943, 60 heavy bombers were lost in a single mission against Schweinfurt. German fighters and anti-aircraft guns extracted a terrible price. But the Americans absorbed the losses. Factories replaced the aircraft within weeks. Training programs produced replacement crews. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force was stronger than it had been before Schweinfurt. And now it possessed long-range escort fighters. The P-51 Mustang transformed the balance of power. Bombers could be protected all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe faced an impossible arithmetic. Every American aircraft destroyed was replaced by several more. Every experienced German pilot killed represented an irreplaceable loss. Training hours were slashed due to fuel shortages. New pilots entered combat, minimal experience. By late 1944, some German fighter pilots flew their first combat mission with fewer than 100 hours in the cockpit. Hermann Göring, who had dismissed American production figures as fantasy, lived to see his Air Force destroyed by the very industrial power he had mocked. After the war, he admitted that the tempo of American shipbuilding, particularly Henry Kaiser's program, had shocked German planners. Claims of ships being built in days had seemed impossible. They had been true. By early 1945, the strategic situation was hopeless. Germany fought on 3 fronts, with resources insufficient for one. The Eastern Front consumed men and materiel at an unsustainable rate. The Western Front collapsed under Allied pressure. The bombing campaign devastated industry, transportation, and fuel supplies. Factories that survived years of attack finally failed when their supply chains were severed. German soldiers continued to fight, but they fought without hope. Fuel was rationed to drops, ammunition was hoarded, vehicles were abandoned. Replacement equipment no longer arrived. The army that had once executed rapid, coordinated offensives now improvised simply to remain in the field. Hitler retreated into delusion. On April 30, 1945, he died in his bunker beneath Berlin, still convinced that his analysis had been correct. If Germany had lost, he believed, it was because the German people had failed him, because his generals had betrayed him, because fate had intervened. He never accepted that his fundamental assumptions about America had been wrong. Yet the evidence was overwhelming. The nation Hitler dismissed as racially inferior and socially decayed had outproduced Germany by nearly 3-1. American industry provided roughly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment, approximately 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 193,000 artillery pieces, and over 2 million trucks. These figures were not propaganda. They were material facts. Henry Kaiser did not remain a public figure after the war. His shipyards were dismantled or converted. The factories that launched a vessel every few days returned to civilian production. Willow Run, which had produced bombers faster than Germany could destroy them, eventually built automobiles instead of aircraft. The men and women who created the arsenal of democracy returned to ordinary lives. Farmers became welders, then farmers again. Housewives became riveters, then teachers and clerks. Millions of Americans who had done extraordinary things under pressure faded back into anonymity. Only decades later were some of their contributions formally recognized. The German misjudgment of America was not merely a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of imagination. Nazi ideology demanded that America be weak. Diversity contradicted the racial worldview. Democracy contradicted authoritarian assumptions. To preserve belief, German leaders dismissed evidence. They began with conclusions and selected facts to support them. They mistook unpreparedness for incapacity. They mistook debate for disunity. They mistook comfort for weakness. They did not see what actually existed: a society capable of reorganizing itself at speed, absorbing failure, learning faster than its enemies, and converting abundance into sustained military power. Isoroku Yamamoto understood this about America. He had lived there. He had studied it. He warned his nation accordingly. Germany never produced an equivalent voice of caution because it never took America seriously enough to study it honestly. The factories that built Liberty ships and B-24 bombers are mostly gone. The workers who staffed them have passed into history. But the lesson remains. Nations are not static. Societies that appear weak in one moment may become powerful in the next if they possess organizational capacity and the willingness to adapt. The limits observed in peacetime are not the limits revealed in war. Germany believed its head start was decisive. America erased it in months. The miscalculation that doomed the Third Reich was not tactical or operational. It was conceptual. Hitler looked at America and saw only what his ideology allowed him to see. He was looking at the wrong America. The America that mattered was not the America of his prejudices. It was the America that built ships in days, aircraft in hours, armies in months, and learned faster than its enemies could respond. That America won.